Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Open Data Days Thematic Session 2, Data for the People. My name is Chris Burns, and I'm actually connected with you from the European Parliament. And, you know, this is about crunching data, the numbers for people so they can better understand what data is all about, whatever we're talking about. And in this case, this first presenter will be on the value of nature, the use of green spaces during COVID pandemic lockdowns. We're going to be talking with David Lusseau, who's professor of marine sustainability at the Technical University of Denmark. You're interested in wildlife tourism management to minimize its biodiversity footprint and maximize its public health and community benefits. But in this one, you're going to be talking about the benefits of green spaces during the pandemic lockdowns. David, let me just alert people that if you want to network, you can continue doing that on Swapcard, and also send any questions via Swapcard. Hashtag EU Open Data Days if anyone wants to pass any words along that they hear from David or any comments that they have. Just to set the ground rules, because we have 5 presentations now in an hour and 15 minutes, and each presenter has 13 minutes to present their case, their slides, and then we'll have hopefully about 3 minutes to talk. So let's see if we can work that. David, I think quite interesting. I saw your slide presentation, calling for an open data Marshall Plan. I think that's really great. That's a good headline for me. Anyway, David, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I'll just move a slide. Perfect. Well, oh, sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Chris. My name is David, and my research mission at the Technical University of Denmark is to understand how people use nature, what benefits they are extracting from these interactions, and importantly, find new ways for communities to make use of those interactions and these associated benefits to create new well-being income streams. And the role of all of that is to try to make of the European Green Deal a success. So today I want to talk a little bit about what has happened over the past 2 years during the pandemic, and starting with exactly that question. When I talk about nature use, what do I mean? For 3/4 of the European population, when I talk about nature, I talk about something a little bit like what's on this picture. It is green space. 3/4 of the European population lives in cities, and that means that the daily interactions they will have with nature comes in the form of urbanized nature. We know that exposure to that urbanized nature provides mental and physical benefits. And the past 5 years, I've seen a wealth of studies really demonstrating that simply being exposed to green space and blue space provides benefits. Yet we do not know what the demand for that green space is. Not only don't we don't know the demand, we actually don't know how it is accessed and how people are accessing that. So right now we have a great potential to meet the European Green Deal through the use of green spaces, yet we have very little understanding of how it is used. So we decided to actually make use of the past 2 years as a natural experiment. Over the past 2 years, people in Europe have been restricted on the time they can spend outdoors through different phases of lockdowns. And the assumptions we made was that, well, if green space is something that is important to everybody, then we would expect people to sacrifice some of that limited time they're outdoors to spend some time in green space. However, that might depend on whether people can afford to do so. And they can afford to do so depending on how much time they have left compared to the rest of the time that's taken by other activities. These measures of time freedoms or affordance are often associated with level of deprivation. So we decided to look for an understanding how green space was used in neighborhoods with different levels of deprivation. That meant we had to look for places where we have open data on green space availability. Sorry, I'll just go through this. I should have removed that. Here we go. And indices of multiple deprivation. We could do that in London, Paris, and Berlin, where we have indices of multiple deprivation collected at a district level, at a neighborhood level, if you prefer, as well as curated green space locations. So where there is green space, which is fully accessible to all in principle. And we made use of that data to try to understand across the two phases of lockdowns that we can see through the past 18, 19 months that we have been living so far, which corresponds to these phases where people were required not to leave home. So I'm going to focus, this work is more widely looking at the whole 19 months of time. Here today, we're only going to focus on what happened during this lockdown period, the required not to leave home. The first question we had is, did people talk more about green space during these lockdowns? So to look at that, we first looked at Google Trends and looked for the topic park, which is associated to any kind of green space use across languages in those locations. And we also searched the Twitter archive via the API academic track for mentions of parks or gardens geolocated in London, Paris, or Berlin. And what did we find? First of all, for the search trends, we found that people search more for the topic park in the three cities during the 2020-2021 period compared to the previous years. But actually, this increase in search was preponderantly associated with the phases of the pandemic when people were not in lockdowns. And the main searches were where our parks opened. And during the lockdowns, what park is near me? So people are looking for green space during that time. If we looked at the topics of conversation on the social media Twitter, which were more prevalent during the lockdown phases in those three cities, what we find is that people were essentially describing enjoying time in some of those green spaces. And what we find is in all three cities, the tweets on parks and gardens receive more likes during the lockdown, regardless of the topic of conversation on those tweets. So did people spend more time in green space? To get at that with open data is very, very difficult. So we partnered with Facebook Data for Good program, which provides data in crisis times to understand how the Facebook population density at a very small spatial resolution, in our case 600 by 600 meters, changed compared to normal pre-pandemic traffic in that case. This information is provided daily at 3 time periods, overnight, during the day, and in the evenings. And so that means that for each of those tiles, we could understand the proportion of the tile that was covered by green space from our open data, what was the central tendencies in multiple deprivation for that tile, again from the open data, and bring it with that public data from Facebook to ask what was the departure from normal density of Facebook users during the day and during the night. So why do we look at both days and nights? Well, we could simply look at the changes during the day. And in lockdowns, people might be we know, spend more time at home. So it is conceivable that we could have found association with daytime Facebook population densities with green spaces simply because neighborhoods have more green spaces. So to look for the effect of green spaces, we simply actually looked at the departure of this daytime population density compared to the nighttime one. If people indeed spend more time in green spaces simply because they stay put in their residential areas, then this difference should be 0. But if it's not, then that means they spend more time during the day somewhere compared to others. So first we looked at those tiles that were green space rich, which correspond in the 3 cities to the main parks. And what we found is that the daytime density was greater than normal in Berlin and London during the first wave of lockdowns, but significantly lower than normal in the second wave. In Paris, the parks were closed during the first wave, and so therefore that's why we see this pattern. So is the question that people didn't spend more time in green space in the second wave, it wasn't in the first wave. This is where the modeling outcome on this difference between daytime and nighttime is important. So what we found, first of all, that for all cities and for both metrics, the population densities departure from normal traffic depending on green space coverage, and this association depending on lockdown waves, the level of deprivation of the tiles, and whether this was a weekday or weekend. Overall, we found that the daytime population density decreased through the waves. So this is what it looks like for London. This is the London average daytime population density for departure, where -4 corresponds to 4 standard deviation less than normal in dark orange, and the reverse for blues. And in London, what we found, so we're going to see these graphs for the three cities. We are looking at weekdays versus weekends graphs. And if the data is above these black lines, that means that people were spending more time in those locations during the day than during the night. In green, we've got affluent tiles, these locations. In blue, average. In red, deprived locations. And then we've got our three waves of lockdowns that we saw in London. And the x-axis here corresponds to the proportion of tiles covered by green spaces. And what we found is that across those three waves of lockdowns, that we have this scissor effect, where essentially the more green space a tile had in an affluent area, the more people it received, and it was reversed for a deprived area. And what we find is that this effect, this scissor effect, if you prefer, decreases on weekends. And so therefore, we see that actually deprived green spaces are starting to receive more people during weekends. If we look at Paris, the same picture again of central tendencies in daytime population densities, we find, of course, parks being closed during the first wave, we saw very little changes compared to normal. But again, we see this scissor effect during weekdays, which is disappearing during the weekends, where again, we see green spaces receiving more people. And then in Berlin, we find a reverse effect. We find actually that deprived locations, neighborhoods, were receiving more people the more green space they had. And we saw actually very little departure from normal density in affluent areas. So what do we find from that? Well, firstly, that we saw fewer people through the succeeding waves in the cities. And that is correlated with anecdotal evidence that there was, of course, less people visiting those cities, but also some people leaving those cities. We found that green space attracts those that stayed when they could, and actually this attraction increased through the waves. But it depends on deprivation factors. In London and Paris, it's affluent green space areas. So one could think that it is simply because those green spaces in affluent areas are more attractive, but actually we find that during the weekend, these deprived locations, green spaces, are attracting people in the same way. So it is more an affordance issue, an ability of people to be able to seek that green space when they can. And in Berlin, we find that in deprived area, but actually we are missing deprivation values for very large section of a district, which happens to be quite green space rich. So maybe that is why we are seeing that. Once people were in green space, on social media, they report enjoying it for a range of reasons, whether it's experience or activity. So where is the issue? We have an issue where green and blue space access, we know, is a critical urban asset. We are finding in the pandemic, it's a critical asset. However, only some cities provide spatial information. No one maintains regular access data. And there is very little planning to maximize the benefits, because we don't know, we don't design green space to maximize well-being benefits when they are there to provide them. A lack of green space is a dimension of deprivation. So actually one of the first steps we should be taking is to actually ensure that green space access becomes a dimension of indices of multiple deprivation. The observed benefits of green space exposure directly affect the non-communicable diseases, which we know are more prevalent in deprived urban areas. So the question we should be asking, we need to ask now, moving forward, is how do we design public health interventions using green space with smart objectives? How do we design experiential affordances, ensure there is physical activity opportunities, and the provision of ecosystem services for neighborhoods? And there we have to really provide kudos to the National Health Service in Scotland and England that has started to provide what they call green prescriptions, having GPs asking people to spend time in green space as a means to tackle non-communicable disease. But that information, the people are lacking the information needed to design those public health interventions. We can learn from social media posts what are the assets providing benefits and how people access those benefits. But as Chris mentioned at the beginning, I think we need an urban public open data Marshall Plan to really provide open data about health and well-being at a scale which is relevant to human geographies. We don't have that at the moment. It's often national data at best, regional data at best. We need something at the neighborhood level. And we need to provide infrastructure data to the people that can provide these public health interventions. Finally, not only can we do that for public health interventions, but also we need to think about how to provide that data to the communities, to the neighborhoods, so that they can actually grow new sources of well-being growth and well-being income. I want to thank, of course, DFF for the funding for this, Facebook Data for Good program, Rosie Bailey, one of my PhD students that helped for that, the data team at Berlin, Paris, and London. And I want to dedicate this talk to Robert Poujade, who passed away last year, and who was a great green space advocate for more than 40 years. Thank you for your time.
David, thank you. Merci beaucoup. We're out of time, darn it, but at least you got to that Marshall Plan punchline. I think that's very important to point that out, how much more needs to be done, and very interesting to hear about